you a question, and that is, why is Jerusalem sacred? And anybody in the audience tell me? Chris, why is Jerusalem sacred?
With the landing site of the Anunnaki. With the headquarters.
Well, Richard.
It's mentioned 600 times and more in the Tanakh, the Jewish scripture.
Okay, it's mentioned 600 times in the Bible, almost as many times as God. But that's not the reason why Jews, Christians, and Muslims venerate Jerusalem, and why Jerusalem is without doubt the issue that is behind all the talks about peace or no peace in Israel, in the Near East, etc. I think one could say, starting from the latest backward, that Jerusalem is venerated by the Muslims because according to a single passage in the Quran, one memorable night, Muhammad was visited by the angel Gabriel, who took him to Jerusalem, not to Mecca, but to Jerusalem. And there was waiting for him a white winged horse called, by no coincidence, Barak, who took him to heaven for a one night's visit to heaven, where he met angels and all the previous prophets, as the Muslims call them, Jesus and Abraham and Moses, etc. So Jerusalem is venerated by the Muslims because that is where the angel took Muhammad to be taken from there to heaven. So from Jerusalem, and from a particular spot there in Jerusalem, he went to heaven, wherever angels and others are there. And if you then ask, why was he taken to Jerusalem and not to Mecca? You say, well, you have to go back a little in history, because Muhammad, in creating a new religion, borrowed from the Jews, borrowed from the Christians, and that's the latest previous one to him. Jesus was active, the whole story of Jesus, his life and his death is connected with Jerusalem. So the Muslims' veneration of Jerusalem is linked backward to the Christian veneration of Jerusalem. So why do Christians venerate Jerusalem? Oh, well, of course, because that's where the whole story of Jesus has taken place. The so-called Last Supper, which was really a celebration of the first night of the Jewish Passover holiday, and all the other events that followed took place in Jerusalem. But why was Jesus in Jerusalem? So we go back again and say, well, because as the New Testament says, it was a tradition that the family of Jesus kept, that devout Jews were required, were encouraged to make 3 annual big pilgrimages to Jerusalem, Passover being one of them. There is even a little vignette in the New Testament that on previous such pilgrimages, Jesus as a boy was gone, and because it turned out he was hiding from the family because he did not want to go back to Nazareth, so he hid from them. So it was a family tradition to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. So why was Passover celebrated in Jerusalem? Why were Jews required or encouraged to make 3 annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem? Well, because that's where the temple was. The temple that Solomon built, and later on, after its first destruction, it was rebuilt. And the whole story of the building of the temple is connected with the Exodus from Egypt, because the temple was supposed to be principally a housing, a final place of rest for the Ark of the Covenant, in which the 2 tablets with the 10 Commandments were kept. So you go back to the story of the temple and the Jewish requirement by God's request and command that those tablets of the covenant shall be kept at a specific place in Jerusalem. And so the question is, why was that in Jerusalem? And as I sit down, I want to start by showing you that if anyone with any knowledge of history, geography, topography, development of civilization, would be asked to choose a place to keep the Ark of the Covenant, the last place would be where Jerusalem is. Simply put, Jerusalem should not be normally where it is. So, having answered myself the question, why Jerusalem, through all those various religions, we will start by finding out that it just doesn't make sense for Jerusalem to be where it is if you just read the Bible or follow archaeology, etc., unless you happen to be one of those who read Sitchin's books and find out that there was a totally different reason for locating Jerusalem where it is. And that's what we are going to talk about.
Put some tape right here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Darkness at noontime.
Is that dark enough right now?
Mm-hmm.
Is that dark enough to start? You have to advance so I can focus.
Well, if the people trust their neighbors, make it darker. Okay. Okay.
You're gonna need the,
Good.
you're gonna need this.
Yeah.
You wanna stand?
Okay. So here is the first slide of this afternoon, which shows you a map of the ancient Near East. I'm supposed to have a pointer with me. That's okay. Okay. So this is the ancient Near East, which hasn't changed much geographically over this past several thousand years. This is the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern part of it, which was called the Great Sea at the time, in biblical times. This is the Persian Gulf, which was called in those days the Lower Sea. This was sometimes also called the Upper Sea, the Lower Sea. And the area of ancient civilizations and ancient events was really between those two seas, and this is the Red Sea, which featured in biblical tales. As you can see, even at a glance, that there are hardly any cities, any settlements, anybody living in all this area. This is today's Arabia, Saudi Arabia. And this is really basically desert lands with hardly any rainfall. And these ancient civilizations developed and grew along rivers. In this area, the plain, the basin of the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, two of the rivers of the Garden of Eden, two of the four in the Garden of Eden. And this is where the very first civilization, known civilization, that of Sumer, developed. A little farther north, Babylonia, a little farther north, Assyria, a little farther north, the Hittites, and so on. And this was called the Fertile Crescent, because like a crescent, it made half circle, and then down the Mediterranean coast, again you see settlements. And then there was the Nile civilization, Egypt and Nubia, the Sudan, etc. And the trade routes, which I'll show maybe in the second slide. Okay. Okay. And the trade routes between those civilizations to the east and those to the west and south were along this connecting land called Canaan in the Bible, the land of Israel, Palestine in modern times after the Philistines who occupied this part of the coast. And the trade routes actually followed geography, and they were really either this way, and once one reached from there here, there were two ways. One was called, until Roman times, Via Maris, or the way of the sea, following the coastline past the Sinai Peninsula into Egypt, and the other was called the King's Highway, which was on this side to the east of the Jordan River, down here. And here there was really nothing. And when I mean nothing, I will, wrong button. When I mean nothing, I will show you that if you look just a few kilometers outside of Jerusalem, which is here, if you look outside, this is what you see. You see barren hills. So this is a familiar sight of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and then you just see rocks except where somebody came and built a house or a settlement. Otherwise, it's all rock. And one of the problems of Jerusalem, as of the whole of the land of Canaan, was the question of the shortage of water. There was total dependence just on rainfall, since there was no major river. The hallowed Jordan River isn't much more than a brook, and especially in these days. And the struggle to supply that place with water was a continuous one. I have chosen this slide to show you an aerial view. This is the Temple Mount, this whole area, the Temple Mount, with the walls that if you visit Jerusalem, you can follow them this way. And this is the old city. And again, where the people came and built their houses, but when you just leave the built-up area, again, all you see is rocks. An interesting aspect of this aerial view, for which I don't offer a specific explanation, but there must be some explanation, and that is in this area of the Temple Mount, which is one large man-made platform, there are a lot of underground cisterns to collect rainfall, and therefore you see this is a verdant section. But somehow, on a more ancient platform, upon this platform, not a single tree or bush grows. For whatever reason is for one to just speculate or use imagination. Now, if you go to the old city, when you say Jerusalem, Jerusalem, why is Jerusalem important or central? You're really talking not about the new quarters here or some Arab villages here, so-called East Jerusalem. You're talking about the old city, And this is how it is more or less stay divided in the last centuries, even after the British captured Jerusalem from the Turks in 1918. So there is the Temple Mount, and then there are the various quarters, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Jewish quarter, and so on. And if you compare today's, more or less, today's Jerusalem, or central Jerusalem, to a previous one, and this one is how Jerusalem looked in Roman times, which is the time of Jesus, you see again that it's basically the same thing. There is the Temple Mount, and from it there grew various suburbs or more later settlements, getting different names. in the Roman times during the Jewish revolt against the Romans. This was called the upper city, and this was called the lower city. In terms of antiquity, besides the Temple Mount, this was the most ancient area, and this was then added, and this was added, and this was added, and then this was added, and so on. And now, this I'm going back now to the time of the kings of Judea, David, Solomon. This particular one is from the time of a king called Hezekiah, where again you see the basics of the city, the oldest part, the newer part, and then the newer part. In those days, this is around 1000 BC. And then this one, which I chose this map in particular because it indicates the tunnel leading from the spring of Siloam to the central collecting point in Jerusalem. Now, this was already a city wall in the time of the Jewish, Hebrew, Judean kings. And the great thing was that the main source of water for Jerusalem, apart from collecting rainwater, was this spring. And it was outside of the city walls. So when, according to the story in the Bible, in the book of Kings, when the danger of an Assyrian invasion of Judea was looming, Hezekiah ordered the construction, which was at that time a tremendous engineering feat, of an underground tunnel, hidden tunnel, that led from the spring outside the city walls and wound its way into the city, within the city walls. And this is the route of the tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel, from outside the city into the city. And as you see, it wound not only its way not only geographically or topographically, but at some point here, it seems to be a kind of a diversion. And with this comes a very interesting biblical story, because in order to speed up the construction of the tunnel, as the invasion by the Assyrian king was looming, the construction started from both ends. There were tunnel diggers, if that's the word, who started this way, and others who started that way. And the problem became, when they were both around midway, where to meet, how should the ends meet. There is an actual inscription that was found on the walls of the tunnel at that spot, that describes how the diggers from both ends one day heard the hammering or the digging from one end. They heard the hammering of those from the other side, and knew how to dig towards each other and meet. So this inscription was on the walls of the tunnel in beautiful Royal Hebrew script from that time, around 1000 BC. And the reason it is shown like that is because when it was discovered sometime in the mid-19th century, and the land, Jerusalem, were under Turkish control, the Turkish authorities ordered the inscription cut out of the walls of the tunnel, of course not without damaging it, and brought it to the museum in Istanbul. So the interesting thing about this is not only this is literal physical evidence confirming the biblical tale, but there are other documents supporting the veracity of the Bible. One is an Assyrian stela, that's not the stela, an Assyrian stela by the king Sennacherib, who describes the siege of Jerusalem, and the stela is now in the British Museum. The inscription is in the museum in Istanbul in Turkey, and the tunnel is in Jerusalem. And those who have traveled with me on some of my so-called Earth Chronicles expeditions have been, if they went on all my trips, have been to all three places. We went through the tunnel in Jerusalem, we were in Istanbul, and the museum and opened that floor for me to show me and my group the inscription, and we saw the inscription of Sennacherib in London. So what was it there, as we keep seeing each time, that any time, any plan you look at of Jerusalem, this seems to be there all the time. And this Temple Mount, which, as I said, is a large platform, and this is about 15 to 2,000 feet long by about 500 or so wide, so it's quite a large paved platform. This seems to be there all the time. Now, the first one to settle and to choose Jerusalem as the capital and move it from Hebron to Jerusalem was King David. And the Bible tells the story of how King David, having been told by God that it's time to build a permanent housing for the Ark of the Covenant, told him where it should be, and told him it should be on that mount where this platform existed already in the time of David, before he even moved to Jerusalem. And the Bible refers to the place as the threshing place of, I think, not Uriah, but I forget the exact name, a Jebusite landowner who owned the place as a place where the wheat was separated from the stalks and through threshing, as illustrated in this depiction. And when David came to this Jebusite owner and said, I need a place because I'm commanded by God to build there a house for the Lord, the Jebusite said, fine, it's fine with me. Now, which corner, which specific part of the threshing floor do you need, and I'll let you use it. And David said, no, I need, and my people need to own it. We need to have permanent, forever ownership of this place. And after some negotiation, David paid 600 gold shekels. Now, the currency at the time was a shekel, which was a certain weight of silver. And normally, when the term shekel was used as the price or the amount paid for something, it always meant a silver shekel. And here, the payment was in gold shekels, which was 600 gold shekels. At the time was probably at least, what, 1 trillion euros? I mean, which currency should we quote these days? So, and David purchased the place. However, once he did, a prophet called Nathan at the time came to him and said, I have bad news for you, because you have done certain things which are not to the liking of the Lord. You spilled a lot of blood in your wars, and therefore the temple which you have started to find a place for it, etc., will be built not by you, but by your son Solomon. And this is the ground plan, at least, of the Temple of Solomon, or sometimes called the first temple in Jerusalem, which consisted of 3 parts: an entrance, foyer, if you want to call it, a central hall for worship, and behind a screen, a veil of cloth, not of metal, not of wood, and not of stone, but of cloth. There was the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant, which was made of wood, covered with gold, inlaid with gold inside and out, and on top of which there were 2 cherubim, presumed to be winged beings, like winged angels, which one could see in Egypt or in Assyria, but we don't really know exactly how they looked, so I didn't want to include a picture as if that's it. So, but and the whole device, this chest or ark inlaid with gold inside and out, which could be a transmitter, actually was called a dvir, which literally translated from Hebrew means the speaker, because that was the device through which God spoke with Moses in the desert during the Exodus. So this was the plan of the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, and the most important part was this Holy of Holies. Now we jump through the ages. There was, as I showed you, the Roman period of when Jesus was, then there was the Byzantine Christian period, and around in the middle 7th century AD, we are now into AD, the Muslims coming out of Arabia started to seize the lands. They seized the Near East, they seized the parts of North Africa, they seized the parts of Europe in the Balkans, they seized eventually parts of Spain. So there was quite a Muslim thrust starting in the 7th century from the ancient Near East, from what we call today the Middle East, into Asia, Africa, and Europe at both ends, Spain on the one side and Turkey, Albania on the other side. And this is how Jerusalem looked during the Muslim or Mohammedan period that lasted from about 650, in round numbers, 650 AD to the collapse of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in 1918, when the British captured Palestine. So you deal with more than seven centuries, during which time Jerusalem remained more or less the way it was centuries before. And Jerusalem was never not only a capital of any of the Muslim caliphates or other political or royal entities. It was not even an administrative center. The administrative center for the land that's called by the Arabs now Palestine was Damascus in Syria, and the local administrative regional center was in a town called Ramla, not Ramallah, but Ramla, which is a few miles away from the coast where Jaffa is today. So Jerusalem was totally neglected, was of no particular consequence to the Muslims for the 7 or whatever centuries they were in control of it. And as a matter of fact, at the time of the British capture of Jerusalem in 1918, where a census was taken of the population of Jerusalem, the total population was about 75,000, of whom 65% were Jews. The total Muslim population out of that was 12,000, and the rest were Christians. So historically, there's absolutely no connection between the Muslim world and the Muslim religion with Jerusalem, except that one night trip by Muhammad to heaven. Nevertheless, that one night and where it started from seemed important because the first caliph ruler, Muslim ruler from what is now Damascus, decided to build a building around the rock which was the heart of the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple. So the structure is called, the way it functions, the Dome of the Rock, because there is a dome that distinguishes the site and all the pictures you ever see of Jerusalem because of the dome. And the dome is gilded. It's not made of gold, but it's gilded. And the interesting thing is, and you'll soon hear from me why, the interesting thing is that the dome, which is not a typical Muslim roofing, was brought over from a place in Lebanon, but the Caliph who reigned from Damascus, by the Caliph, from a place in Lebanon called Baalbek. And there, a place that was revered from antiquity. In earlier times, and followed by the Greeks, and followed by the Romans, and followed by the Byzantines, and followed by the Muslims, etc. Everybody came and built their house of worship, a church, a mosque, whatever, on that place in Baalbek. And the Caliph just took the dome, and that was the covering or ceiling of the Byzantine church at Baalbek, and moved it and used it in Jerusalem. So this is the story of the Dome of the Rock, which is the dominant structure as you look at pictures of Jerusalem. And this is a close-up of the gilded dome. If you want to know exactly the location, by the way, in my book, The Earth Chronicles Expeditions, of which I have a copy here, but it's dark so you can't see it, but David may have some extra copies. I write about Jerusalem, I write about some of the things I'm going to tell you about, and I have this map that I prepared for the book, and it shows that the Dome of the Rock is exactly located over the area where the Holy of Holies. You remember the tripartite architecture of the Temple of Solomon. This was the Holy of Holies, and the Dome of the Rock is built precisely over that spot. This is how a look from above, from the ceiling down to the rock on which the Ark Covenant stood. And this is the very ornate ceiling inside. This whole thing is very decorative. And this is a diagram that shows more precisely. I wouldn't go into the details, it's in my book, but this is again shows the rock and how this structure precisely covers it. Now, travelers in the 18th, but mainly in the 19th century, when access was a little easier to the Temple Mount than at other times under Muslim control, always I found out depicted that this is where the rock is, they depicted a cave under the rock. A cave, and sometimes two caves, one below the other. And this was so predominant, and I went over, I don't know how many, but any source I could find of a map, a sketch from 18th and 19th century travelers always showed at least one, and sometimes two caves under the rock. This is the rock, and these are the caves. I was especially fascinated when I came across this woodcut that shows that there were actually stairs leading from the floor area above there where the rock is, stairs leading down. The walls are covered with carpets, and somebody is praying or whatever. Now, this whole thing intrigued me because one of the mysteries surrounding the the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant, is that at some point the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. There is a whole story, likely or not, I don't know, that says that when the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon, and they had some hanky-panky, so a son was born, and the son who was born when the Queen of Sheba already was back in her land, went back to Jerusalem, and unable to claim a kingship in Jerusalem, he at least decided to have some important relic from Jerusalem, and he stole the Ark of the Covenant and took it back to Ethiopia. The tradition in Ethiopia at that time used to be called Abyssinia, was that the Ethiopian kings, though they were converted to Christianity, were really all descendants from the line of Solomon. And during World War II, the Ethiopian king was in exile in Jerusalem because the Italians captured Abyssinia. One of his titles was the Lion of Judea. Now, this is an unlikely story because the Queen of Sheba came from Sheba, which was in Arabia and not in Africa. So, but anyway, some have written about it, and it's a fascinating tale. There is some underground church cut into the rock at some place in Abyssinia where the ark supposedly is seen, but only by the high priest of the Ethiopians. So, but according to the best information provided by the Bible itself, there is a verse in the Bible that says that when Jerusalem started to be invaded by the Babylonians, we eventually captured it and eventually destroyed the temple. The priest hid the Ark of the Covenant, and the words in Hebrew are "in its place." And I just wondered, seeing all these double caves and all this thing, whether "in its place" means that it was taken from above down one cave and maybe a second cave. So on one of my trips to Jerusalem, it took a lot of doing. I tried to do it officially through some contacts with the Muslim authorities that are in control of the place. And they said, well, it'll take weeks until I might get approval. And then one of the aides there in the office, the Waqf, the authority that keeps control of Muslim shrines, one of the guys came to me and said, if you can come back tomorrow with some money, I'll let you in. So, so I came back the next day with some money, and he let me in. And as a matter of fact, I took with me some of those who have traveled me, like later on Chris, to be recognized. Eric traveled with me. Who else here? I don't know. David, well, David, of course. So I actually came back the next morning with Wally, who was like a mission photographer, and he was able to photograph things that nobody was supposed to photograph. and he stood guard up there to warn me if somebody comes, and I actually went down. I went down those stairs up to here, and I could not determine if there is an opening to a lower cave, because everything was covered with carpets, the way it's here. And what I wanted to see is how large is the opening, because the Bible gives the exact measurements of the Ark of the Covenant. And I wanted to figure out if the opening, if it exists, if it is wide enough for the priest to have hidden the Ark there. So I did not succeed fully in that mission. Now, as I mentioned, the platform, all stone platform, has many cisterns to collect water, rainwater, but it also has various subterranean tunnels that form like secret entrances or secret ways either to enter or to escape from whoever will besiege the Temple Mount. So there's this one, and there's this of particular interest, this one, which is closest to where the Holy of Holies was, and the question unresolved is whether, if this was the rock on which the Ark stood, if there are actually two cavities, two caverns down, is there somewhere a connection to this point here, so that, because this one can lead out and serve as an escape. Now, this is the western retaining wall. This whole Temple Mount is surrounded by a retaining wall, some of it from Roman or the time of Jesus, which is the second temple, and some going back to the very beginning of this whole structure here. And the interesting part is that the lower you go, the more ancient and the more colossal the structures are. So this little portion here of the western wall was until Israel recaptured Jerusalem, the old city, from the Jordanians who controlled the area. Until then, the whole access to the famed Western Wall, or as it sometimes was called the Wailing Wall, because Jews for centuries have come here to wail, to bewail, to cry, bewail and decry the destruction of the temple. So this, believe it or not, was the whole wall that was visible for centuries, this part, for centuries, from the Western Wall, which was much larger, and from the whole temple compound, and from the Temple Mount, and from the remains of the temple, and from the Holy of Holies, and from the sacred stone, etc. This was the only part where Jews for centuries could come and bewail the destruction of the temple. On a personal note, I can tell you an anecdote, a personal experience, and that is that the access to this, even under the so-called enlightened British rule, from 1917 until they left in 1947, and Israel was established, except that this was under Jordanian control until 1967. So under the British rule, the Jews were allowed to come and pray. They were allowed to come and bewail, but they were not allowed to sound the shofar, the ram's horn, at the end of the most holy day, which is the Day of Atonement. And it was a catch if you can game of young Jews at the time, there was no Israel yet, to congregate and fill up this area with as many people as could squeeze in, and at least one of them had with him a ram's horn, and the British were frantically searching and searching, and each end of the Day of Atonement the ram's horn was sounded. And I was there a few times in the crowd that defied the British. So when Israel recaptured the holy city, one of the first things that were done was to remove all the buildings that over the centuries were encroaching and encroaching and encroaching ever closer to the remains of the first temple. And they created a plaza and revealed a much larger section of the wall, which, if you look at this aerial photograph, that little part used to be the so-called Wailing Wall, and that whole part was cleared, except that the encroaching buildings here were not removed. Now, this aerial shot is interesting for another reason, and if you remember the maps of ancient Jerusalem that I showed you under this time and the Judean time and the Roman time, etc., etc. So you always see the Temple Mount high above, higher than its surroundings. And then you see here a slope. And that is, if you remember, the oldest part called the City of David. So when David was told to buy the threshing floor to build the house of the Lord, he already had his capital in Jerusalem, but not on the Temple Mount. There was no temple yet either. Down here, so the question that one must ask himself is if this was owned by a Jebusite or like a Canaanite landowner or farm holder who just used this as a threshing floor, nothing else was built here at the time, and David moved his capital from Hebron, which is further south, to here, and this is the city of David, and this is all sloping down and sloping down. Who builds his capital at the lowest point of a place and not at the highest point of a place? Does this make sense? So whenever I started to look at the topography of Jerusalem, this always was a question that I couldn't find an answer to it in any textbook. Nobody had an explanation for me. Why would a king who was a great military tactician, who defeated almost everybody else, whose realm extended almost to Damascus in Syria and across the Jordan to what is today's Amman, why would he choose the lowest place in the area to build a city and not the topmost place? An interesting part answer came to my mind, was because this particular section here had a name. One name was called the Ophel in the Bible, in Hebrew, the Ophel, and the other was Milo. The Ophel means the place or the area used for going up, and Milo meant the filling, the filled up area. So in fact, archaeologists in recent years have been digging here, have found out that this area was actually artificially served as a platform, as a way up. Somebody filled up the valley-like portion here to connect the city of David to the place where eventually the temple was built. So this whole thing was known, was deliberate, etc. And the only reason that I could find, and I'm back to my own theories, is that the reason that David could build his capital here and not here, because this was an area sacred to God and not for people to live on. So he chose it here. He filled up this area and the below, and or the Ophel, the climbing up place, in order to be able to reach the elevated platform. So this gives you the shot here of the Western Wall, and also explains some other enigmas connected with Jerusalem. Let's go back a minute. Now, I mentioned that as archaeologists were able, especially under Israeli control, to start excavating all around here. So let's say in this corner, the southwest corner of the retaining wall of the platform, I mentioned that the lower and to the more ancient sections you go, the bigger and more massive are the stones. So here is a sketch, a photograph and a sketch. This is a photo, this is a sketch. So when you visit or when you have the aerial photographs, this is the part you see. This is the part that was, somewhere a little more here, the Wailing Wall. And you see how many more courses went down, more ancient, and you see how bigger the stone blocks became the more you went down. And this is even more prominent when you go to this end of the wall, as it was extended, the plaza in front of it extended, and you go to this part, not here, which I showed you before, but you go here. Now these buildings here were not destroyed for whatever reason, too many of them or whatever, but there is a way to go in which was opened with great physical, archaeological, and political difficulty. And this is where you are. If you enter that area, which I showed you, you're about here, and then you go some steps down, and then there is another level below it, and then there's another level below it, and the same story, that the lower you go, the older and the more massive the structures are. As you go if you go in here and continue all the way until the exit, it is called the archaeological tunnel. As you go there and you start to walk not on this level but on that level, you pass by some very interesting spots. On one spot there is a sign that says, if I can read it, this point is located opposite the foundation stone, which is the site of the Holy of Holies. So without going back with all the slides, you remember what I showed you, the actual, and I wondered whether there is a connection if you go to one lower cave and one other cave, whether there's a connection, and according to this, there is, or there was. Another spot is another one further north along the wall, which says that it was a secret passage. Again, maybe it was used, maybe it was not used by the priests to hide or smuggle out the Ark of the Covenant. Now, along that tunnel, it's tunnel simply because there are those other buildings that were not removed. But this was an open area in antiquity at the time of the first temple. You come across some colossal stone blocks that are not ground level, which continues further down and down. So these are stone blocks. The area is too narrow to capture the size of them, and I tried it in different ways. This is the group that was with me. They all wore white hats so that we would recognize them in the crowd, except me, I wore a blue one, being the captain. And I don't know if David will recognize himself here or Chris, but anyway. So this is a colossal stone block, and this is another shot of it. It starts there, and it continues, and couldn't get the end of it. And these stone blocks weigh about 600 tons each. Now, in case you wonder what it means, 600 tons stone block, the largest single stone block in the Great Pyramid of Giza is 25 tons. And so this is at least 40 times more. I sometimes used, when Cadillacs were Cadillacs, I said it's like piling up 300 Cadillacs on top of each other and quarrying it somewhere and then trying to bring it over here and lift it and put it on top of other courses, because this goes down and down and down, as I've shown you. Again, you know, or you can guess my explanation, who could carve and quarry and lift and place such colossal stone blocks. But sane archaeologists, not nuts like me, sane archaeologists, of course, try to explain it somehow. Now this illustration is from a most recent book on the subject, an expensive book by highly regarded archaeologists who show you how simple it was to move the stone blocks. You quarried them, you put them on a cart, and you brought them to where they should be. And two not mules, you know, 2 bulls would do that. No problem. In case you say, well, but it was still a problem, well, so then I say, yeah, but these people were ingenious, so they used the stone block as the axle. You see, they took a stone block and they built the wheel around it. And that's how they rolled it to the place. You see, even one gives them instructions, a little higher, a little higher. So, okay. Now, to sum it all up, we now are realizing that there existed a vast stone platform. By the time David came there, indeed by the time Abraham came there, because the first time Jerusalem, as Ir Shalem, from which Yerushalayim comes, Ir Shalem, the city of Shalem, already existed at the time of Abraham, because when in the Bible, in Genesis 14, there's a story of an international war, of an invasion of, let's call it Canaan, by kings, an alliance of kings from the east, and Abraham was involved in defending what I say was the spaceport in the Sinai Peninsula. And when the whole thing was over, in recognition of his saving captives, including his nephew Lot, and recouping the booty and so on, he made a stop at the city of Shalem, Yerushalayim, and the king, who was the high priest, and it clearly says the high priest of the El Elyon, of the God Most High, in his name blessed Abraham, and Abraham was offered to keep some of the booty. He said, I will not do that. I did not do it for this kind of reward. Refers to the God Most High as Yahweh, Jehovah. And so that was already at the time of Abraham, at least 1,000 years before the time of David. So there was already a sacredness to this place. So here you have this vast platform. Here you have this city of David below with the filling leading up. This is a cut of it. And if you try to calculate the work involved, the quantity of earth moving and stones and stone blocks and others to fill up and create a level stone platform was a huge undertaking, which obviously was beyond the ability of 2 guys with a cart. And the only similar place, but much more impressive and bigger than that, is a place called Baalbek in Lebanon, which probably not by coincidence, the Caliph borrowed the Gilded Dome from there, the Christian one, the Byzantine one, and used it as a dome, as a ceiling for the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And this place is called Baalbek in Lebanon, which I visited again with one of my groups. And it is referred to, if you drive there on the way, there are signs saying with arrows to the Roman ruins. Roman ruins, because the last ones to build their temples there after they removed the previous religious temples were the Romans. And there was a series of temples, the largest of which was to Jupiter. And this temple to Jupiter right here was the largest one in the Roman Empire, larger than any temple to Jupiter, even in Rome itself. And what you see there, if you visit it, is that this place again, like the one in Jerusalem, is built layer upon layer upon layer of stone blocks that are more colossal the lower and the more ancient times you go to. The place is a stone platform of 500,000 square feet. Parts of it are encroached by now by buildings, by modern residences. But this is at this northwestern corner was this temple to Jupiter, leading from very complex and very impressive, I must tell you, structure even after 2,000 years, what remains of it to this. So this particular northwestern corner is the one that draws the most attention, because as you start to climbing up and going west, you climb from there, west, you start meeting these stone blocks that start with, down there, with blocks that are about 600 tons each, which is the same size as you have in Jerusalem. And then these are about 900 tons each. And then you reach a place, the western wall, where 3 colossal stone blocks, known as the trilithon, lie or were placed side by side, 1, 2, and there's a third one, over these ones. And these weigh 1,100 tons each. Now there's no equipment today that can lift 1,100 tons or even 900 tons or even 600 tons or whatever. Just to give you an idea of the comparison, you see the midget there? The midget there? That's me. Yeah, I'm the midget there. So this is a colossal plate. That's not me. You see the colossal. So you see 1, 2, 3 stone blocks like that. Now, as it happens, we know where they were quarried, because one of those colossal stone blocks was quarried about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away from the so-called ruins, down in a valley. The quarrying of it was not completed. This part still sticks in the ground. And if you want to know how large it is, that's how large it is. So, at some time in the past, someone quarried it here, precisely, you see, they are precisely cut, lifted it, took it over there, and placed it exactly where they should have been, where some extraordinary strength of the wall was needed. And this, as you could see, if you, without going back in slides, is not on ground level. It's in one of the higher courses. So it was quarried, cut, lifted, taken there, and put exactly in place where it belongs. And now this is on the western wall of this structure, and there are 3 of them, and that's exactly what you find in this archaeological tunnel in Jerusalem. Those 3 colossal stones are also a trilithon in the western wall. So to say, well, could be that the same engineers who could cut and lift those stones were the same, maybe it is so. So if we don't want to speculate who really built the great stone platform called the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, we are certainly allowed to speculate who built this one. And by the way, this is an illustration of a spacecraft launched by the Chinese. Now, we are used to seeing our spacecraft, the shuttlecraft, launched from Cape Canaveral, from a steel structure that is wheeled and then it's removed, and the Chinese built it all of stone. And after I saw that picture, I realized what Baalbek was. Baalbek was a launch site built of stone. Because this goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And that indeed there was once a rocket ship standing there. We find depicted in a Phoenician coin from Lebanon, depicting Baalbek in those days, and clearly showing a rocket ship, unless it's a very large pencil, standing on a platform, and you see the retaining wall and all that. So we have the story of the Sumerian king Gilgamesh. You must all be familiar with it by now, who around 2900 BC or 2800 BC, the date is in some dispute on how you calculate, was the son of a goddess. His mother was a goddess, and because not his father, but his mother was a goddess, he was not just a demigod, half a god, he was 2/3 divine, according to his own epic tale. And he came to his mother, the goddess Ninsun, and said to her, if I'm 2/3 divine, why should I die as a mortal and should not have the longevity of the gods? And she told him, well, you have a point here, but in order to attain our longevity, you have to go to the planet from which we came, because that is why we have the longevity, because of its orbital period, which is much longer, actually 3,600 times longer than the one on Earth. So he went in search of a place from which he could be taken aloft to join the gods on their planet. And one of the places was Baalbek, which is called in the text the landing place. And there is a section in the Epic of Gilgamesh where he describes that when he and his helper reached the place in the cedar forest, which is the only one, the only cedar forest known is one in Lebanon, where Baalbek is. So during the night when they encamped before trying to enter the cedar forest and reach the place, he actually saw a rocket ship being launched. And this is a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh, written almost 4,500 years ago. And it says, the vision that I saw was wholly awesome. The heavens shrieked, the earth boomed. Though daylight was dawning, darkness came. Lightning flashed, a flame shot up. The clouds swelled, it rained death. Then the glow vanished, the fire went out, and all that had fallen was turned to ashes. And that's from the Epic of Gilgamesh, of what he saw at the place that the text names as the landing place. Now, we come to perhaps the most unexpected part of my talk, if anybody was wondering ahead of time what I will say. If you have read my books before, if you have had my talks before, you may recall that in answer to the question, how did I become involved, interested in the subject? And I sometimes tell that it all started when I was a schoolboy, let's say around 10 years old, 10, 11. And we were studying the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, in its original Hebrew language. And we reached chapter 6 of Genesis, which is the chapter that says that, and maybe I'll read it, so there should be no misunderstanding here, what I'm talking about. And it says, now this is the King James translation, the standard King James translation. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, in the Hebrew it says the sons of Elohim, which is a plural word. This is what here it says, a singular God. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. In the Hebrew, again, it says that they were compatible. And they took them as wives of all which they chose. And the Lord, which in the Hebrew Bible says Yahweh, said, my spirit shall not always strive with men, and that's why he decided to bring the deluge about. And then these verses go on to say, there were giants in the earth, or other translations says upon the earth, in those days, and also after that, after the deluge, when the sons of God, the sons of Elohim, in the plural, came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, and the same, and they became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. In Hebrew, the term uses Giborim, mighty men. And these, of course, were the demigods because the children born to gods, the sons of the gods, and the daughters of men were by definition demigods. And it so happens that in other books, not in the canonized Bible, but in books that are extra-biblical books, like the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, and others, the place where this event, that the sons of the gods came down and seeing the daughters of men took them as wife, the place is named, and that is Baalbek. So now we have a platform much larger than the one in Jerusalem, but in many ways similar, that directly links it to events described in the Bible and in much greater detail in the Sumerian text on which these tales are based. And if you also recall my youth days story, is my whole interest in the subject came because when we came to this word here written, there were giants upon the earth, I raised my hand and said, excuse me, my teacher, but why do you explain the word as giants when the word is in Hebrew is Nephilim, Nephilim, which literally means those who have come down, those who have descended, the so-called fallen gods in Sunday preachings. And I was expecting to be complimented by the teacher. I thought you'd say something very good, Sitchin, you know your Hebrew. And instead he reprimanded me very harshly because he said, you don't question the Bible, which I was not doing. I was, on the contrary, trying to point out the need to accurately understand the meaning of the Hebrew terminology. So here we have a direct link between Baalbek and the smaller platform in Jerusalem with this whole tale of the demigods, of whom, as I said, Gilgamesh was one, except that his mother being a goddess, not a father god, but a mother goddess, he was 2/3 and not 1/3 divine. In modern terminology, what does it mean that he was a demigod or that he was 2/3 divine? And that means that his DNA was somehow different. If only his father would have been a god, then so much of his DNA in his genome would be one way. But since the mother, from whom a second kind of DNA, called mitochondrial DNA, is also passed from generation to generation, so since his mother was a goddess, he was 2/3 like her genetically, and not only one hair. Now, I thought that I'll surprise some of you, all of you, with the news that a new book of mine is coming out. I myself had a surprise when some told me today that they already have the book. It was not supposed to be out before the 18th, and today I think is only the 16th. Anyway, so this book deals directly with that issue of gods, demigods, and says, and that is in the last chapter, if people will have the patience to read chapter after chapter in the order in which I wrote them, and that is that I claim in this book, and I think I proved the claim, that two skeletal remains uncovered in some excavations in Sumer some 80 years ago, and are deemed to be those of a queen and a prince, are actually of a goddess and a demigod. And though everyone, including me, assumed that those remains were found and 80 years ago and discarded, that they were still kept, and they are in the basement of an important museum with whom I've been in touch, and until now has refused to do a DNA comparison with our DNA. Because if a comparison is made, and if it's discovered that the DNA, especially of the female, who I claim is a goddess, directly linked genomically with the gods who came from Nibiru, then I'm revolutionizing science, religion, archaeology, all the other scholars can make a big bonfire of their books, and so those who possess the remains are not eager to do the testing. The publisher is thinking of launching a petition by readers of my books who would sign a petition to the particular museum demanding that the test be made. So we'll see what comes out of that. But anyway, so this is a direct link also to the whole story of Gilgamesh and Baalbek and the DNA and chapter 6 of Genesis and the platform in Jerusalem. Now, how do we know this whole part that I've told you about, that the gods of so-called mythology were actually physical beings, that they came from another planet, that they were here, that they did this, that they did that? We know that because of the Sumerians. The Sumerians, who are the people credited with the first known civilization in what is now southern Iraq, that's how they looked. And they were the first to give us the wheel and commerce and transportation. They built high-rise buildings called ziggurats with the use of bricks. They were the first to use bricks. They were the first to invent writing. And this is a simple tablet recording some inventory, because these are numbers, the first ones are numbers, but from which there evolved long texts and epic tales and lullabies and so on, a whole literature. Literally tens of thousands of tablets, inscribed tablets, have been discovered. They were the first to develop the cylinder seal, which by taking a stone, or most often a semi-precious stone, and carving it in reverse, and then rolling it on clay, wet clay, the positive image would come out, like the rotary presses these days. And a permanent image would remain of whatever they want to tell us. This one, by the way, happens to have the sign of the cross, which I will mention in a minute too. They had music, musical instruments, musical notes were found that can be played even to this day. And the most amazing part, perhaps, was their knowledge of astronomy. This is depiction of the tale of how agriculture, the plow, was granted by the god of agriculture to mankind. It contains here a depiction of a solar system, which is an amazing one. It's a cylinder seal that readers of my books by the thousand have gone to Berlin to see it. I think we have people here who have done that. And this is what it depicts: a solar system, complete solar system, with the sun in the center. If you compare it to what we know about our solar system, not by stretching the planets, but as if they orbit the sun, you see that between Mars and Jupiter, there is one more so-called unknown planet, which the Sumerian text called Nibiru. There is a long 7-tablet text known as Enuma Elish, or the Epic of Creation, which says how this planet happened to become a member of our solar system, and dealing with its great elliptical orbit that brings it back to our vicinity every 3,600 years. Whenever that planet returns to our vicinity and becomes visible again, its usual symbol, which is a winged disc, becomes the symbol of the cross. And I thought that in particular this afternoon it's important to mention the origin of the symbol of the cross preceding the time of Jesus. Now, we know much of what the Sumerians have written down to tell us by a certain tablet. It's actually not a flat tablet. It's called a prism. It's in the museum, Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It is known as object number WB444. And it tells the story of how civilization on Earth began. The term used for civilization is Namlugal, and it says, or translated sometimes kingship, and it says that kingship was lowered from heaven. And it lists all the kings, 10 of them, rulers from Nibiru, who reigned here for 432,000 years, our years, which is only 120 of theirs in total, who reigned here until the deluge. So this is a document that mentions the deluge for the first time, long before it's mentioned in the Bible. And then it says that after the deluge, kingship was lowered again from heaven. And this is close-ups of the dates and other information given in the tablet. How did those people who came from Nibiru, the so-called ancient gods, look? According to the Bible, when the Elohim, which is the equivalent of the biblical Nephilim, biblical and Sumerian Anunnaki, biblical Anakim, when they decided to upgrade the hominid that they discovered on Earth by adding some of their genes to make the hominid into a Homo sapien, let's say, they said, let us fashion the Adam in our image and after our likeness, both internally and externally. So therefore, when sometimes people ask me, how did they look? Did they look like us? I say, no, we look like them, because that's how they made us. So here's how two of their males looked. Here's how one of their females looked. And you see here she's dressed with some flying gear of an astronaut. And this is an image from a cylinder seal that I chose to show you because it shows one of them based on Mars, greeting one who is based on Earth, with a spacecraft between them. Somebody corrected me and said, this is not a spacecraft, this is a communication spacecraft, because it has antennas. If you see the difference in terminology, I don't. It's a spacecraft between the two planets. And this is from 2500 BC. And this is in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Because those who were stationed on Mars, when they came to Earth, had their base at Baalbek. So this is one of the guys who came and saw the daughters of men, and that they were compatible and had children by them. And this is a scene depicting how the gods, and actually a goddess, we were not created by a god, we were created by a goddess named Nincharsag, so all the ladies in the audience can take credit. And there are stories in the Bible, also in Sumerian text, about some chosen individuals, and this one is Enoch, who were taken up to visit the Nibiru. There are Sumerian tales about Adapa and Meduranki and others, so some were privileged to be taken aloft, as Gilgamesh wanted to be taken unsuccessfully for him. And this is scenes depicting how the symbols of kingship were granted to kings. And here we come to the question, why is Jerusalem important? According to all the information that I culled from the tablets, is that when they started to settle here and put into full operation the reason they came here, which was the need for gold with which to protect the atmosphere on their own planet, they built a spaceport. They built a mission control center, the term for which in Sumerian was Dur-Anki, the place of the bond heaven earth. It also sometimes was referred as the naval place, because all the other places were equidistant from it. And so it was in the center. And the layout was such that a landing corridor, landing and takeoff, but the landing corridor was formed like that, with the mission control center here and the spaceport there. Now all that was wiped out by the deluge. After the deluge, a new layout had to be created, it could not be done there anymore because it was covered with millions of tons of mud. So this one was the layout of the landing corridor after the deluge, according to my conclusions. And it again was anchored on the two most prominent peaks in the Middle East, the twin peaks of Ararat. It had to pass through and include the landing platform, which, if you recall, the whole tale of the giants on Nephilim over here, before the deluge and after the deluge, which means that the platform had to exist even before the deluge, and it remained, so it was included in the layout. Twin peaks were formed here where there were no mountains, which is the two great pyramids in Giza. And equidistant from there and from there was chosen the point to serve as mission control center, as a new navel of the earth, as a new Duran key. So when you complete this whole layout and you see that this place, eventually known as Jerusalem, is equidistant, is in the center, and is exactly the same form, the same triangles and the same landing pattern as the previous one. You now understand why Jerusalem is where it is. It was not intended as a settlement for people. The platform built there, smaller than the one in Baalbek, was to serve as one of the key points in the contacts, in the relationship, in the bond between heaven and earth. And here is a quote from the book of Ezekiel about why Jerusalem is where it is. And the Lord says, "Thus has said the Lord Yahweh, this is Jerusalem. In the midst of the nations I placed her, and all the lands are in a circle round about her." Now what could be more explicit than to explain this design? So this is why Jerusalem is where it is, in a place that there's no water, and there's no rivers, and there's no roads, and there's nothing. So the two peaks in Giza, the two artificial mountains, were emptied, especially the Great Pyramid, was emptied of its guidance equipment when rivalries between the Anunnaki clans, I call them in my book the wars of gods and men, the pyramid wars. The equipment was removed. In the Sinai Peninsula was the spaceport, and this is an Egyptian depiction of the silo that was there. But, and that's, by the way, the two places where Gilgamesh went to, Baalbek and the spaceport. But the spaceport, that's again, very few people know, even after I wrote about it in my book, that there's an actual tablet, Sumerian tablet mentioning Abraham, but that's a story in itself. Okay, so there is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which again in the Sumerian text is explained in greater detail, in especially something called the Era Epic, that in the end, in the rivalries between the various Anunnaki clans, nuclear weapons were used to wipe out the spaceport, leaving a great crater and a break in the peninsula to this day. And to this day, if you visit it, as I and people with me were, you see in the midst of pure white limestone mountains, there is this whole area with barren through, broken up, gravel-like rocks, totally barren through and blackened to this day. And this is the sum total of it. There were 4 places that served as links between Earth and Nibiru, between us and the Anunnaki. The post-diluvial spaceport, Giza, Baalbek, and Jerusalem. So Giza was emptied of its equipment in the Pyramid Wars. This one was destroyed in the nuclear Holocaust, and this is in ruins from Greek and Roman times, and the only one that is left as a portal is Jerusalem. What would happen to Jerusalem? And all the prophecies about the end of days, I think I'll skip it, but anyway, there is a prophecy in Ezekiel about the final war of Gog of Magog, and the thing that makes me feel like a chill in my spine when I read that prophecy is because he says, of all the nations that will join in that final war to attack what is today the land of Israel, the first one that is listed in Ezekiel is Persia, which is today's Iran. And I will not put on the lights to read it because I've spoken long enough, but and I wonder, I told it earlier today, I wonder whether my parents' name is Zecharia just because they like the name or because of some profound reason which they themselves didn't know, because the most specific prophecy in the whole Bible, Old and New Testament included, with all the prophecies about Armageddon and all that in this, that says that God, Yahweh says, I will return and make Jerusalem where the seat, royal seat of David shall be established by his descendants. I will return and make Zion again a center for the nations. And that is in the prophecies of Zecharia. So if after this long talk you want, I can still show you exactly where in Zecharia. So when we talk about Armageddon, one has to realize that it's really a name of a place in Israel. It comes a distortion of Har Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo, which was a strategic place from time immemorial. And in my book, The End of Days, which preceded the one I showed you, in that book I say that the prophecies that in the Bible are called the end of days, which are not the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is the return of the planet. The return of the planet itself is not, I'm stressing, not imminent And therefore I am really chagrined when I see articles and movies and this that really frighten people that it's the end, and monsters are coming to use us as food or whatever. And I say, please stop the nonsense. The ones who will come, not on the day of the Lord, not the planet, but who will come at what the Bible calls the end of days, when there will be finally a return, but preceded by great trials and tribulations, will happen. I say so in my book, The End of Days. I stuck my neck out, and I still stand by it. Will happen this century, because this century is still the last century of the age of Pisces. And this is when the return will take place. And it is probably, again, no coincidence that in excavations very recently, near Megiddo, at the foot of Mount Megiddo, the remains of the first Christian church in the land of Israel after the life and death of Jesus. The remains were found at the foot of Mount Megiddo, and there a beautiful mosaic floor was discovered. And what is the design on that floor? Pisces, the age of Pisces. So these are the predictions and prophecies of Zecharia. Thank you.